Sunday Baroque Conversations is made possible by the Friends of Sunday Baroque and is produced at WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. I'm Suzanne Bona. Thanks for listening. Don't miss an episode of Sunday Baroque Conversations. Subscribe on Apple, Google, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a review. If you want to find out where you can listen to our weekly show, visit our website, sundaybaroque.org, for a station list and our 24/7 stream. Again, that's sundaybaroque.org. Schultz is a Baroque flute player who's performed with top ensembles including Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra, Tafelmusik Baroque Orchestra, Apollo's Fire, Portland Baroque Orchestra, the Vienna Academy Orchestra, and Chatham Baroque. He's also performed on more than 50 recordings. A graduate of the Royal Conservatory of Music in Holland, he also founded the early music ensemble American Baroque in 1986. Stephen Schultz is an associate teaching professor in music history and flute at Carnegie Mellon University and director of the Carnegie Mellon Baroque Orchestra. And he joins me on Zoom to talk about his life in music. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So let's go right back to the beginning. When did you start making music? And I'm really curious to know, did you start on the flute? Did you start on some other instrument?
So it was fourth grade. I think I was 9 years old, and it was auditions for the band. And I wanted to play saxophone. I thought that was a really cool instrument, so I put that down as number one. I also thought the jazz clarinet was nice, so I put clarinet as two. And I couldn't think of a third instrument, so I said, I'll put down flute. So we get there for the audition day, and they stuck a saxophone in my mouth. I didn't know what to do with the reed. They did the same thing with the clarinet, and then they put a flute up to my mouth, and I made a little toot sound. They went, "Okay, you're going to be a flute player." So that's pretty much when I started the flute.
Wow.
And I started playing in elementary school band and orchestra, and all the way up through junior high school and high school. I was in the bands and orchestras. And it turns out, of course, I loved the flute, so I was happy to play it, especially when we had to do marching band on the Friday night football games where everybody was carrying their tubas and bass drums and trumpets, and I just had to carry a little piccolo and play, so I was very happy about that.
Right. It's like super easy to carry a piccolo around.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
But
I grew up with classical music. My father was a total classical music freak, so he took me to concerts when I was 4 and 5 years old, and so it was kind of in the household. So I loved that kind of music right away from the beginning.
Oh, interesting. So how did you nurture that? I mean, you started off in the school band. At what point did you think, oh, well, gosh, this is really what I am meant to do, and maybe start, getting more serious about it?
Sure. I practiced all the time, and I really enjoyed playing music, and I enjoyed listening to music, but I didn't think it was a very good way to make a living because I saw a lot of musicians around me who were not making a very good living. And I had the dream of being a doctor. I don't know why, look good on TV. So when I went to college, I went to UC San Diego for a year, and I was pre-med. And it was great until I got an F in chemistry and decided probably I shouldn't be a doctor. So I immediately changed my major to music, transferred to UCLA, and started taking serious flute lessons at UCLA. It was the year of the Kent State, massacre by the National Guard, and everything was on strike. And exactly at the same time, I heard a recording of Franz Bruggen, the great Dutch recorder player. It was one of his first Baroque flute recordings. It was Handel Trio Sonatas. And I just heard this on an LP, and I totally fell in love with the sound of the wooden flute. I'd never heard anything like that before. And I always gravitated to Baroque music. It was just my favorite period of flute music. I like contemporary music too, but I never had the incredible chops to play the Rite of Spring or anything like that. So the minute I heard the Baroque flute, I said, I really want to do that. And since school had stopped, I had a friend who was going to Holland. There were only two places in the world where you could study early music at this time in the 70s. It was either The Hague or Basel, Switzerland, and I didn't really want to move to Switzerland. So I went to The Hague, took an audition, got in as a modern flute player, paid the $50 a year tuition to go to school there. Yeah. And I had a great modern flute teacher named Franz Vester, who also played Baroque flute, but he laid down the law. He said, I don't want you to start playing Baroque flute until you get better at the modern flute. Because what was happening at that time was a lot of people were transitioning to period instruments who couldn't quite cut it in the modern world. And he was smart to that. So I hated that at the time. And so, but the first 4 years I was in The Hague, I was a modern flute major. Unbeknownst to him, I was sneaking to Belgium to take private lessons with Bart Kauken on Baroque flute. I just fell in love with it. And finally, the last 2 years I was in The Hague, my teacher relented and I could do full-time lessons on Baroque flute.
Wow.
So that's how I got into it. I graduated, I came back to LA where I grew up, and I put my modern flute in a case and waved it goodbye and just basically started trying to make a living playing wooden flute.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
You know, you just touched on a subject that I'd love to hear your opinion on because, back in the day, back in the mid to late 20th century when Baroque music was sort of re-emerging as a popular period in history for people to listen to and to play, you're right. There were a lot of people who just couldn't cut it, or there were a lot of very poor recordings as well, on these sort of like little rinky-dink labels and things. And there were a lot of people dressed in costumes playing goofy
With puffy shirts,
with
yeah,
puffy
yeah.
shirts, yes. And the quality and quantity and professionalism, not only of the playing, but even of just the recording qualities, has so changed in these years. It's just really gained incredible momentum. I'd be really curious to know your take on that. Like, how has that been to really be on kind of the cutting edge of that whole wave of the evolution of Baroque and early music and historically informed performance practice?
Really good question. So when I was in The Hague, I was one of the very few Americans who came over to study early music at the time. Now, of course, there's dozens, if not hundreds. So it was the beginning of the wave. And when I moved back to America, there were very few wind players making a living with it. So it was definitely pioneering time. It was also the same time that Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra was starting up in San Francisco. And I basically got in my car and moved up to San Francisco and auditioned for the orchestra. That's a whole story, which I'm not going to get into, but I got into the orchestra finally. And we started playing, and you're right, in the beginning it was rough. These are new instruments for us, and we had to learn how to play them. And we had to learn what they did, what they didn't do. And as the decade proceeded, and when we get into the 80s, and really in England and the rest of Europe, the standard just kept on going up and up and up of how people played their instruments. The recordings got better, interpretations got better, and we hit the 1990s, and it's, there's no looking back. The virtuosity of the players was just fantastic, as it remains now. I mean, they're cranking out students from Juilliard every year in their early music program that are phenomenal technicians.
Yeah.
Things have definitely risen for sure. And whenever I think it's kind of peaked, there's more things going on. I just got back from the 3 weeks in the Oregon Bach Festival and a month at Carmel Bach Festival. And it was fantastic. It's live concerts again. The audiences were really hungry for it. And, it's very popular, as you know.
Now, I think not everyone necessarily knows. It's sort of a little bit of insider here because, because I do play the flute, but modern flute. But could you talk a little bit about the similarities and differences between the modern flute that people are probably more familiar with? They see it, they go to the orchestra, or they played it in fourth grade or whatever. And the various types of Baroque flutes as well. I don't know that people necessarily are clear on what the difference is between those instruments.
Sure. Do you want to pause here and I can run and get a modern flute and a Baroque flute and show you physically, or do you want me to just talk about it?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I'll be right back.
All right.
So this is a modern orchestral flute. It's what you see whenever you go to, New York Philharmonic or San Francisco Symphony. It's made out of metal, and it has about 22, 25 different keys that you push down for every different note. If you think of a piano with all the white notes and black notes, all you do is do different fingerings, and they all come out equally beautifully. This flute was invented around 1830, 1840. But before then, this is more what the flute looked like. It was made out of wood. It had only one key at the end, thus it's called a one-key flute or a Baroque flute. And you cover 6 finger holes very much like a recorder player. You blow it like a flute, but the reason I like it so much is, well, first of all, it's great touching wood. It's much more organic feeling. and you can feel your breath going through the flute as you play. This flute was not built with equality in mind like the modern orchestral flute. An F is just as strong as an F sharp, which is just as strong as a G or a G sharp. On the Baroque flute, since I don't have keys, anything outside my home key of D major, I have to do these strange, what are called cross fingerings to get out the chromatic notes. So let me play a chromatic scale from the bottom, and you'll hear some notes are strong and some notes are weak, depending on how many fingers I'm pushing down. So there's kind of a built-in patchwork texture, if you will, on this flute. And that's why it's beautiful playing this music, that the composers knew that a G sharp was a soft note. So they're not only writing it, for the melody or the harmony, but they're writing it for the texture. Mm-hmm. And that's what you miss by playing it on the modern flute. People say, well, if Bach had a modern flute, he would have used it. Yeah, of course he would have. But Rembrandt would have used spray paints if he had them, I guess. But you have the colors and the palettes that the composers knew, and this particular flute is a copy. I don't know if you can see the whole thing. The original flute was made by an Italian flute maker called Carlo Palanca around 1745, 1750. Though I make a nice living playing and teaching, I can't afford $200,000 flutes. And most of the flutes that exist in museums aren't playable. Unlike violins that have been played continuously throughout the centuries, the original flutes have been sitting in museums, and so they're cracked and they're not in very good condition. So modern makers go and do the measurements, and they make what are called modern copies. This is a modern copy of the Palanca flute. It was made by a German maker, Martin Venner, about 8 years ago. And it's a gorgeous flute. This particular flute is made out of dark wood. It's made out of grenadilla. They also make flutes out of lighter wood, Turkish boxwood, which is a brighter sound in the higher octaves, but I like the lowness and the richness of this. Originally, these pieces, which are called bushings or purely ornamental, were done with, unfortunately, ivory from elephants, but since they're endangered now, it's just fake ivory.
Right.
So that's the major difference, that there are no keys and that all the different notes have sort of a different quality to them on the Baroque flute.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you not only play Baroque and early music on your Baroque flute, but that you also do some contemporary music on your Baroque flute.
It's true.
Yeah,
it's
so
true.
That's kind of cool. So how does that work? I mean,
that started because I had a girlfriend at the time in the 1980s who was a composer, and she got tired of me bitching about, I love Baroque music, but that's all I play. And she wrote me a modern piece, a solo modern piece for Baroque flute. And I stopped bitching because it took me about 6 months to learn it because it was really difficult. Wow. But it really turned me on to the possibilities of that. And ever since then, with my group that doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, American Baroque, but also with a composer who's my colleague at Carnegie Mellon named Nancy Galbraith, who's written about 7 pieces for me, I basically amplify the flute. So either I put a Barkasberry pickup here like a modern flute player has, or I play directly into a microphone, and it makes the flute amplified and electric, and I can also step on pedals and do kind of wah-wah like guitars or echo or delay, and it's really fun to do. Besides the fact that it's fun to play contemporary music, it's fun to play loud because the Baroque flute is one of the softest instruments in the orchestra, and when I'm plugged into an amplifier, I don't have to worry about that. So it checks a lot of boxes for me, definitely.
Oh, that's interesting. I also I meant to ask you this earlier when you talked about it. So you didn't get to play the sax or the clarinet. Have you ever doubled back and tried those?
No. Unfortunately not. No, I'm just used to blowing across a hole instead of having something in my mouth and like a reed.
So flute was your perfect fit. It was the right thing to do. So you mentioned being on the faculty of Carnegie Mellon University. What do you enjoy most about teaching? And did your own experiences as a music student affect the teacher you are?
I think so very much. I'm fortunate in that I never got a PhD. I went to school, I got a degree in Holland and a bachelor's degree in America and a master's, and I didn't want to go to school anymore. But I started getting hired as a coach, a chamber music coach, and eventually I'll tell you the story sometime. It's pretty funny. I got a job teaching music history at UC Davis. And I just really fell in love with it. I had to drive to UC Davis, which is about an hour and a half away from Oakland. I had an 8:30 class in the morning for 250 students on music history. So that got my chops together really fast and how to lecture in big lecture halls. And I just really love it. In Carnegie Mellon, I'm there. I was full-time for 20 years. I'm now down to part-time by choice because my concerts in the spring, I just couldn't keep on teaching full-time. But I have a great schedule. I teach a graduate seminar on Mahler, who's one of my favorite composers, Mahler symphonies. I teach a class on Bach. I teach a class on the Beatles for 200 students, and I conduct the Baroque orchestra. So I just, each class has its own joys. The Mahler class is fantastic because all the students love Mahler because they're all studying the excerpts to, get into the orchestras that they want to. So I have a, I hate to call students sponges, but they just want to absorb everything they possibly can about Mahler. Beatles is another kettle of fish. Students are taking it because they need extra credit and they've heard it's an easy A, but they come in very skeptical. Beatles, why do you want to teach a class on the Beatles? My parents listened to it, my grandparents, and by the end of the semester, it's all on their playlist and they're driving their roommates crazy playing Beatles songs. Yeah. And Baroque, it's my first love, and so it's great, being able to coach. Nobody does original instruments in Carnegie Mellon. It's strictly modern players, so it's great to sort of turn them on to a new way of thinking about 18th century music than they normally do with their lessons. Mm-hmm. So I love teaching. It's really fun to do it. I can barely teach a private lesson these days, though, unfortunately, because I'm so much a classroom teacher at this point.
So how do you, I've got to ask, how do you start teaching that Beatles class?
The Beatles class, I teach it chronologically. I go album by album. They recorded what is now on 15 CDs of material. Obviously, there weren't CDs when they recorded. And I start with the history of the Beatles, but it's also a class on living in the 60s because these kids, no matter how bright they are, they barely know about the Vietnam War. They barely know anything about what life was like in the 60s. So I have to talk about that, but I talk about recording technique, how primitive it really was in the studio for the Beatles and how creative and innovative they were with the tools they had. And I just go chronologically. It's basically a 3-hour class once a week. And I blab for about an hour and a half, and then we listen to music, and I analyze it as much as I can with them, knowing that most of them are not music majors. So, if I say the word mixolydian, it's like they start fainting. So I can't go too deeply into theory with them. But it's really fun. It's a really fun class. And it was fun to start doing. When I first started teaching at Carnegie Mellon, my then boss said, well, what do you want to teach here, Stephen? And I said, well, Baroque. I love Mahler and I love the Beatles. And he said, go for it. And he was very liberal with that. So it's the first kind of rock and roll class that is being taught at Carnegie Mellon. So it's really fun to do it.
Well, I'm bummed I can't be closer because you kind of hit 3 sweet spots for me, Bach, Beatles,
Oh, well,
and
maybe
Mahler,
I can get you hooked up online with the class or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have this new recording, 2020 recording, the Royal Concert Suites by Francois Couperin, and I would love for you to talk about these pieces. What's special about them to you? What's special about them in general? Why did you want to record them? And also, if you could talk about your esteemed colleagues who are also performing on this recording.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I made a recording of the Bach sonatas for flute and harpsichord obligato with a colleague of mine, Jory Vinicourt, who I'd met through just playing a concert, and we hit it off really well. We made this recording for this Berkeley-based label, Music and Arts, and it proved pretty successful, and the head of the record label said, what do you want to do next? And I said, French Baroque music, and he said, absolutely not. French Baroque music does not sell, nobody cares about it. And I said, well, that's what I want to do. I love Couperin, and I love these pieces, and so he finally relented. I raised enough money myself to produce what I had to do to make the record happen. And they're just fantastic pieces. They're not specifically for the flute. Couperin wrote them as harpsichord pieces. But he says in the introduction, yeah, they're great on harpsichord, but you can play them on violin or oboe or flute if you want to. So we basically orchestrated them, also a little bit unusually than they are normally done on recordings. Some movements we started just with the harpsichord and the flute came in couple phrases later, we repeat some stuff. So there was a lot of room for discovery doing these. Jory Vinicourt played harpsichord, Alexa Haynes-Pilon played gamba, and my colleague in Philharmonia, Mindy Rosenfeld, played second flute whenever there were two lines that needed to be done. And it was really fun to do. We recorded in Skywalker Sound, which was George Lucas's big plantation. No bad words, connotations with the word plantation. It's his spread in Marin County, where they do all the scoring for all the Star Wars and Pixar films and stuff. And they have a beautiful sound stage there. And I have a really good friend named Jack Vad, V-A-D, who is a very famous recording engineer. He worked with Michael Tilson Thomas in the San Francisco Symphony for 30 years. They both just retired, and he was my producer. So what a producer does on a recording is basically what a director does on a film. You have 12 or 20 microphones right in front of your face and around the room for 4 days, and you play through these pieces, and the producer says, well, that was great, Stephen, but you screwed up measure 21 and 22. Let's do that again. So he makes sure that everything is covered in the music that you're recording. And we had a lot of music. We had 24 separate dance movements of these 4 suites by Couperin. So it was very challenging. The other challenge was that after 2 days, Jack unfortunately got a case of pneumonia, and we had to cancel the sessions after 2 days. And the only time we could reschedule was in March, and we finished recording it like 5 days before the pandemic lockdown that happened in California and everywhere else. So it was amazing that we got through it. But it was a fantastic process, and I'm really happy with it. And happily for the record label, it turned out to be a pretty good seller. It made the Billboard's best seller chart for a couple of weeks in a row, and so it kind of belied that nobody likes French Baroque music. So
God,
happy to do it.
That's another thing that I also adore. I love French Baroque music. I mean, it's just got a very different quality to it. It has
it's really juicy.
Yeah, it's just got a charm and almost a whimsy to it it's just different from Bach or Handel or whatever. Yeah, I love
absolutely.
it. So you proved the record label wrong for one thing, but what else is on your radar now when they come back to you and say, what do you want to do next? What other things do you want to do? What's on your wish list?
That's a really good question. I'm really happy with this recording. I wouldn't say it's like the pinnacle of my recording career, but in some ways it is, because it was, I really wanted to do it. And it was hard work to do it. It's hard work to put it together, but I was really happy with the result. I'd like to record the Mozart flute quartets. They're beautiful. I'd like to record some more Telemann, Paris quartets. One of my first recordings were 3 of those, but they're 12 altogether. But it's interesting recording these days, because CDs don't really sell anymore. It's all streaming, as you know. So record labels don't really want to put out too much product unless they think it's really, really going to sell. And no record labels are paying for early musicians these days. You have to raise the money yourself. So my Bach recording, it was a GoFundMe, which I raised enough money to record it. And the Couperin, I did the same thing, but it was sort of more private donations. So you really have to raise between $10,000 and $15,000 yourself if you want to make a recording. And then the record label, if they're gracious enough, like Music and Arts, they will do all the post-production. They'll pay for the editing, they'll pay for the production of the CD and all the publicity and stuff. But even for a lot of musicians, they don't do that either, record labels. You have to pay another $20,000 to put your record, your CD out. So it's a more complicated process these days, and the royalties. Nobody gets any royalties. You sign your rights away to royalties. I think if I sell 10 million copies of this, maybe I'll get a penny or something. And certainly with streaming, the artists don't make anything not classical wise. It all goes to the label and stuff. But on the other hand, streaming is great because it gets the product out there. And that's how people listen these days. One thing I do in my Beatles class, I talk about LPs, and first of all, none of them knew what an LP was. And they have no concept of sides. I say, well, this is how they started side 1 and how they ended side 1, and they go, what, huh? They understand physically about a side, but they don't understand that when the Beatles or Led Zeppelin or any of the rock groups put albums together, it was important, the order of the songs, and then how something led into another, and they don't have any concept of that when they stream.
Right. Or what B-side means.
Exactly.
Right. Oh, that's really interesting. But I think vinyl is sort of coming back now as this sort of, like retro thing. And
yeah, it's definitely coming back.
well, I guess like dialing a phone, right? Like they don't know what dialing a phone means.
Do you have a record player at home or anything? Do you listen on vinyl or?
I do not know.
Yeah, I don't either.
I mean, radio, CDs really and downloads really work pretty well for that.
Yeah. I mean, I still physically love CDs. I love
Yeah.
like holding it. I
Yeah.
like
Reading the
it's
liner. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I miss the LPs because you could actually read the liner notes because it was big. It was nice. One thing I do in my Beatles class, I bring in some, Revolver or Sergeant Pepper's, and I pass it around, and they can't believe it because, they're used to these small little CDs, if anything. And oh my God, it's so big. So it's definitely a culture shock.
Yeah, it's like a history class. Just
Yeah,
human
exactly. And
history.
speaking about history class, you asked about Beatles. One of the songs I talk about is "She's Leaving Home" from Sergeant Pepper's, about the generation gap.
Yeah.
And I had to explain what a generation gap was to my students.
Wow.
And I said, "How many of you people hate your parents?" I just for a poll, and like 3 people raised their hands. I said, "Wow, when I was growing up in the '60s, we all hated our parents for some period of time. It was just normal rejection." So it's just amazing. The
Maybe those are just the ones that would admit it.
Yeah, exactly. Amen.
Well, I have been speaking with Baroque flute player Stephen Schultz. Thank you so much for your time. All the best to you. It's been a real pleasure.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.